My name is Lucy Jones. I am 68 years old. And if you have ever wondered what it feels like to spend a lifetime building a home only to be treated as though you are a guest in it, then perhaps my story will tell you. I was born in Yorkshire to a postman and a seamstress, and I spent my youth working shifts in a bakery, then at the textile mill, and later raising my son Benjamin after my husband Peter died too young. Every tile on the roof of this house was paid for with long hours and aching hands. Every wall bears the memory of birthdays, Christmases, and quiet evenings, with tea by the fire. So when Macy, my son's wife, leaned close across the Sunday roast and said with a little laugh that I smell like old age, loud enough for Benjamin to hear and for the potatoes on his plate to cool in silence, it was not only my pride she tried to bruise, but the very decades of sweat and sacrifice that made their living under this roof possible. I felt the words land like a cold draft in the room, saw Benjamin's eyes dart away as if the salt shaker had become more fascinating than his mother, and I pressed my lips together until they thinned, swallowing the sting as I rose to clear the plates. I carried the gravy boat and dishes into the kitchen, my steps steady, my heart not. All the while, I could hear the muffled titter Macy gave as though cruelty was a private joke, and I thought of how often I had overlooked these small slights, excusing them as the careless words of youth. But standing there with my hands in the washing-up bowl, warm water turning cold as it always does when one stares too long at the window above the sink, I realized that excusing disrespect is the surest way of inviting more of it. I thought of the deeds locked away in the old biscuit tin upstairs, of Peter's careful handwriting on the letter, where he had urged me never to let anyone diminish what we had built, and for the first time in a long while, I felt not weary, but quietly resolute. Macy thought she was mocking an old woman, but she had forgotten who it was that owned the key in the front door she walked through each day. That evening, I dried the last plate, folded the tea towel neatly, and sat in my chair by the fire. I breathed in the scent of wood, polish, and lavender, the honest smells of a lived life, and I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer be silent. I would no longer excuse. I would remind them whose house this truly was. That night, when the house finally sank into silence, with Benjamin and Macy shut away in the spare room they had long since claimed as their own, I sat at the edge of my bed and pulled out the tin that had followed me from girlhood to widowhood, a battered old Huntley and Palmer's biscuit tin with faded roses on the lid and a hinge that squeaked like an old memory. Inside was not biscuits, but proof of a life that could not be mocked away, proof that I had built something enduring from the ashes of long hours and Peter's steady hand, proof that the house we lived in was mine and mine alone. I lifted the folded deeds, the official stamp still crisp, the name Lucy Jones written in solemn print, and I felt the strange strength of ink on paper, stronger than any insult spoken across a dinner table. Beneath it were the letters Peter wrote me in his careful hand. Some from his days working the late shift at the factory, others from hospital corridors when he still believed he would win the fight with his lungs, each one carrying his voice back to me in the hush of the room. I touched the solicitor's note that confirmed what I already knew, that the semi-detached in which I had poured my whole heart stood in my sole name, bought with decades of careful saving, with books of green stamps I pasted one by one, with extra shifts at the bakery when my back ached, and with the pennies Peter never let us waste. I remembered the day we signed for it, the keys dropped into my palm like a medal, and the promise we made that this home would never fall into the wrong hands. My fingers trembled as I laid each paper back, not out of fear but from the weight of memory, from knowing how much of myself was pressed between those folded edges. Macy's voice still rang in my ears, sharp and dismissive. But here was the truth. Walls I had painted, a garden I had sown, a mortgage I had cleared long before she entered our lives. I thought of my son sleeping down the hall, caught between his wife's thoughtless barbs and his mother's quiet endurance, and I wondered if he remembered those years when we went without holidays, so that one day he would always have a roof above him. I closed the tin with a soft click, slid it back beneath the bed, and felt something shift inside me. Tomorrow I would rise, pour my tea, and smile as if nothing had changed. But I knew in my heart everything had, because I had remembered whose name guarded the threshold we all walked through. When Benjamin first carried his bags through the front door with Macy trailing behind him, I was told it would be temporary, just a few months until they saved enough for a deposit, and I agreed because what mother turns her son away when he says he needs her? But months blurred into seasons, and then into years, and soon the word temporary became a ghost no one mentioned aloud. At first I tried to make space with a generous heart, tucking my knitting basket by the settee, and shifting a few coats to the loft so they could stretch their wings. But gradually I realized the house was no longer stretching. It was shrinking, closing around me like a coat I had outgrown. The spare room where Peter once kept his books and where Benjamin used to revise for his exams became Macy's walk-in wardrobe. Rails of dresses lining the walls, perfume bottles scattered across the dresser that once held Peter's cufflinks. And I was told not to worry. They would only be there until things settled. My own things, the small comforts of a woman's life, began to vanish upstairs into the loft, as if they were clutter, not memories. My knitting basket first, then the old radio I listened to while baking, each removed with a smile and the assurance that it was for tidiness. One afternoon I found my teacups at the back of the cupboard, marked with sticky labels that read "Granny Mugs" in Macy's neat handwriting. A joke that made Benjamin chuckle but left me silent, my throat too tight to laugh. I told myself I had endured worse, that silence could keep peace. But in those quiet evenings when I sat alone in the corner chair, I felt more like a guest than the woman who had chosen every carpet and curtain in this place. It struck me that they saw the house not as a gift of shelter, but as an inheritance already theirs, something to be occupied, altered, claimed. Yet when I stood at the sink, washing the labelled mug, I thought of the deeds folded safe in the biscuit tin under my bed, and I felt a steady pulse of truth that no label could erase. The house still bore my name, every tile, every window, every floorboard, and though they might laugh or rearrange, they could not rewrite the story written in decades of sacrifice. I smiled faintly at my reflection in the kitchen window, knowing they mistook silence for weakness, and I promised myself that one day soon they would learn the difference. I came into the hall one afternoon to find a black bin liner propped against the door, half filled with jumpers and scarves, and on top of it all was my winter coat, the thick woolen one I had bought the year Peter passed. A coat that had warmed me through long walks to work and evenings, when the heating felt too dear to switch on, now folded carelessly, as though it were rags. Macy was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she wrote a label that read charity, and when I asked what she was doing, she looked up with that breezy smile and said she was clearing space, that the coat looked too old, that I would be better off with something new. I bent down, lifted the coat from the bag, shook out the creases, and for the first time in a long while I felt my voice steady and unyielding as I said, "From today, my belongings are mine to decide." The words seemed to hang in the air like a bell toll, sharp and certain, and Macy smirked as though I were being dramatic, while Benjamin kept his eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling with exaggerated indifference. The silence between the three of us louder than any argument could have been. I held the coat close for a moment, felt the weight of it, the history stitched into its seams, and I thought of how many times I had put others before myself, how many times I had allowed small humiliations to pass unchallenged. But not this time. I hung the coat carefully back in the cupboard and turned, noting with quiet precision the look on Macy's face, amused and faintly mocking, and the way Benjamin shifted in his chair, as if he hoped the floor would open and swallow him before he had to take a side. I realized then that I had marked a line across the worn carpet of this house, a boundary they would now have to reckon with, because once a woman remembers her own worth, she does not forget it again. I carried on with my day, boiled the kettle, poured myself a cup of tea into one of the so-called granny mugs, and though my hand trembled slightly on the handle, it was not from fear, but from the aftershocks of finding my voice. They thought they could dismiss it, brush it aside like dust on the skirting board, but I knew that moment mattered, for me if not for them, and I knew who had heard me and who had chosen not to. I walked into the solicitor's office with my handbag clasped tightly to my side, the same bag that had carried lunchboxes and bus tickets in years gone by, and I felt both small and strong as the bell above the door tinkled. Miss Ahmed had known me since Peter passed, a kind-eyed woman with a sharp mind who had guided me through wills, pensions, and the long, slow business of making sense of widowhood. She welcomed me with tea and a steady voice, and when I placed the folded deeds and her old letter on the desk, she nodded, as if to say she already knew why I had come. Together we looked over the land registry entry, her finger tracing the neat print where my name stood alone, unchallenged. The weight of ownership, undeniable. She asked me how things had been at home, and though I did not wish to catalogue every slight, I told her enough about the coat stuffed into a charity bag, about the cups labelled granny mugs, about the silence that followed my words. She listened, not interrupting, her pen tapping lightly against her notepad. And when I finished, she said there were ways of keeping peace without surrendering dignity. She suggested a simple written license for Benjamin and Macy. Nothing cruel or complicated, just clear terms so there would be no confusion. They would contribute modestly to the bills. They would respect the home. And most importantly, there would be a 30-day notice clause if boundaries were crossed. She drafted the document while I sat watching the rain streak the window, and I thought how odd it was to sit there putting order on what should have been given freely, respect from a son, courtesy from a daughter-in-law. Yet here we were, writing it down like rules for tenants. When she handed me the papers, I felt the weight of them in my hands, heavier than their few sheets should have been, as if the words themselves carried a spine of steel. She told me to keep a copy safe and to hand the other to them in my own time, reminding me that the law stood with me, not with anyone who mocked me under my own roof. I left her office calmer than I had entered, the license tucked into my handbag, and as I stepped back into the drizzle of the high street, I felt the first glimmer of balance return, like a church bell ringing faintly in the distance, reminding me I was not powerless, not forgotten, and not alone. I began keeping the diary on Miss Ahmed's advice, a plain, hardback notebook with lined pages that I set on my bedside table. Its cover unremarkable, but its purpose weighty, for within those pages I started to gather the small fragments of truth that might otherwise slip away. Each evening I wrote with deliberate care, the date neat in the corner, and beneath it the details that had pricked or bruised the day, a slammed door that rattled the frame at midnight, a missed contribution to the electricity bill despite reminders, a muttered remark about my old people spices when I cooked curry with cloves and cinnamon the way my mother taught me. At first I felt foolish, as though I were a schoolgirl taking notes on misbehavior. But soon I realized that the act of recording gave me strength, for what is written cannot be denied as easily as what is spoken. I kept not only the diary, but the little slips of evidence that life now offered in abundance. Messages saved on my phone, where Macy quipped that the house was basically ours now, her voice smug in the recorded note that I played back once in the dark to remind myself I had not imagined it. I folded bank statements into the pages where Benjamin's transfers stopped short of what was agreed, clipped receipts from the grocer when I had covered their share, and all the while the notebook grew heavy, not with paper alone, but with a kind of armor. Each line, a thread strengthening the fabric of my resolve. There were evenings when my hand trembled as I wrote, the ink blotting slightly, not from fear, but from the ache of years of silence, suddenly given form. I did not show the diary to anyone, not yet, but I took comfort in its steady accumulation, the way a stream fills a pond, one drop at a time, until the surface gleams. Sometimes, after closing it, I would set my hand upon the cover and feel as though I were touching a shield, a quiet defense against those who mistook my patience for weakness. It was not revenge I sought, but fairness. A line of truth, clear enough that even those who tried to blur it would have to see. Each word I wrote was a stone laid in the foundation of the boundary I had promised myself I would protect. And with every page the house felt more mine again. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and old linoleum, and after my routine scan, I stepped outside with my coat buttoned tight, the appointment card folded in my pocket, expecting to see Macy's car waiting as we had agreed. Yet the car park was empty, except for a bus pulling away, and the drizzle beginning to soak through the shoulders of my coat. I stood beneath the awning, watching every vehicle that turned into the lot, telling myself she was just late, that she would appear with some excuse about traffic. But as the minutes dragged into an hour, I knew she had not forgotten so much as dismissed, for forgetting requires intention once held, and I doubted she had ever intended at all. My phone showed a curt message 20 minutes in. A simple, sorry something came up, and no further explanation, and I felt the cold damp climb into my bones. It was Mrs. Patel, my neighbour, who spotted me on her way back from town, her car pulling alongside the curb, her window rolled down with concern in her eyes as she asked if I needed a lift. Grateful and ashamed in equal measure, I accepted. Climbing into the warm car and letting the kindness of another woman soften the sting. When we reached my house, she touched my hand and told me not to hesitate if ever I needed help. Her gesture more comfort than any words from my own family had given in months. That evening, with the drizzle still pattering at the windows and my patience worn thin, I placed the folded license that Miss Ahmed had prepared on the kitchen table, between the salt cellar and the bowl of apples, and I asked them to read and sign. Macy barely glanced at it before laughing, a sharp, dismissive sound, saying the whole thing was ridiculous, that families did not need contracts. Benjamin shifted in his chair, muttering that perhaps they could look at it later, eyes sliding away from mine as though afraid of what he might see. I watched them both, her smirk, his evasion, and I realized that paper might not win respect, but it could hold the line when words failed. I folded the license again, slipped it back into my handbag, and though they thought the matter ended, I knew it had only begun. For a boundary once written does not vanish simply because others refuse the pen. I had given them the chance to sign, I had set the papers on the table like an olive branch, but when the license was brushed aside with laughter and shrugs, when the behavior in the house did not soften but grew sharper, I knew it was time to use the words Miss Ahmed had prepared for such a day. I sat at my writing desk in the front room, the same desk where Peter once balanced the accounts, and I copied out the 30-day notice in my neatest hand. The ink steady, the tone polite but firm, as though I were addressing not my son and his wife, but any lodgers whose stay had turned sour. I placed the paper in an envelope, sealed it with a press of my palm, and that evening, after the dinner dishes were done, and the silence in the kitchen felt heavy as stone, I slid the notice across the table. Benjamin read it first, his brow furrowing, his lips moving silently over the words. And then he looked up, eyes wide with something like betrayal. asking me how I could do this, how I could turn my own son out with no compassion. I told him gently that compassion without respect was only indulgence, and that the notice was not cruelty, but clarity. Macy snatched the envelope from his hand, scanned it, and let out a high laugh, calling it elder abuse, calling me vindictive, her voice sharp enough to make the clock on the wall seem louder in its ticking. I let her words wash over me, for I had heard too many to let them pierce any more, and I repeated only what mattered. 30 days, be kind, or be gone. Benjamin tried again, pleaded for more time, for understanding, but each plea felt like sand slipping through my fingers, because he was not asking for reconciliation, but for delay, and delay was only another form of disregard. I saw in his face the boy I had raised, the one who once promised to look after me, as I had looked after him, and my heart ached. But love without limits is a chain, and I would not bind myself again. So I repeated the words once more, soft but unshakable, and I watched them both sit in the echo of them, their silence thicker than argument, knowing that a clock had begun to tick that no laughter or pleading could undo. The war began not in my sitting room or at the kitchen table, but on a glowing screen, in the family WhatsApp group that had once been full of birthday wishes and photographs of Sunday roasts, now hijacked by Macy's long tirade about being thrown out by what she called a selfish pensioner. She wrote in dramatic bursts, claiming she and Benjamin were victims of cruelty, that I was unstable, that no decent mother would treat her son this way. Her words peppered with crying emojis and sharp accusations, and as I read them, I felt the familiar ache behind my ribs, the ache of being misrepresented by someone who had never cared to know me. I sat for a while, fingers hovering above the keyboard, and then I decided that silence alone was not enough. Not this time. I opened the biscuit tin, took out the title register with my name printed clear as daylight, and I snapped a photograph of it, along with the unsigned license I had offered them weeks ago. I attached both images in one reply. Nothing more. No explanation or flourish. Simply fact. And I sent it with the steadiness of someone who has learned that truth is sometimes best spoken without adornment. Then I pressed mute on the group, shutting off the cascade of messages that followed. The pings muffled as though I had closed a door on a noisy crowd. In the quiet that followed, my phone began to light up with private messages, some short and sympathetic. Cousins writing that they had seen the way Macy treated me, a niece saying she was sorry for not stepping in sooner, old friends from the village offering tea if I needed company. Others sent more hesitant words, balancing on the fence, telling me they did not want to be caught in the middle, but hinting they understood more than they would ever say aloud in public. There were messages that never came, too. Silences from those who preferred to believe the loudest voice in the room. I read each one carefully, my heart heavy but also oddly lighter. Because support, even whispered, is still support. And shame, even silent, still reveals itself. I placed my phone on the side table, drew the curtains against the evening, and sat back in my chair with the steady hum of the muted thread behind me, knowing I had chosen the calm truth over noisy lies, and for once, that was enough. The morning of the mediation, I dressed with the same care I once reserved for job interviews, smoothing my blouse, fastening the brooch Peter had given me on our 20th anniversary, and walking into Miss Ahmed's office with my head held high, though my stomach churned like a storm. The room smelled faintly of polish and strong tea, the shelves lined with files, the desk clear except for the folder that contained my license and the 30-day notice. Benjamin and Macy arrived together, Macy's heels clicking across the floor, Benjamin trailing behind her with eyes fixed on the carpet. And for a moment I almost pitied him, the boy who had once clutched my hand at the school gate, now unable to stand tall without her shadow over him. We sat, Miss Ahmed in her chair like a conductor holding the baton of order, and she asked me to state clearly what I wanted. My voice did not shake as I laid the choice on the table, as simple as the paper itself. Sign the license with its modest contribution to bills and its promise of courtesy, or leave by the date already set. Macy let out a scoff, sharp and theatrical, and said it was absurd to treat family like tenants, her tone dripping with disdain, as if the very notion were beneath her. Benjamin leaned forward, his hands twisting together, pleading for an extension, asking for more time, for leniency, as though leniency had not already been given in abundance. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who had been given too much indulgence, who had learned that his mother's patience was endless, and I felt the resolve tighten inside me like a knot pulled firm. Miss Ahmed listened without interruption, then closed her folder and confirmed the date in her calm, professional tone, reminding them that the notice stood, that the law was clear, and that follow-up would arrive in writing to avoid any misunderstanding. I saw the flicker of panic cross Macy's face, though she tried to mask it with a smirk, and Benjamin sank back in his chair, his plea faltering into silence. I said nothing more, for the words had already been written, the line already drawn, and when we rose to leave, I felt the weight of years fall from my shoulders, replaced not with joy, but with something steadier. The clean strength of a boundary held. Day 29 arrived with the weight of an unspoken test, and Macy answered it in her own fashion by filling the house with noise. Her friends crowded into the sitting room as music blared so loud it shook the glass in the cabinets, laughter ringing against the walls as if to taunt me. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice above the thud of the bass. I simply picked up my coat and walked down the lane to Mrs. Patel's, where the kettle was already whistling and the scent of cardamom tea filled her warm kitchen. We sat together at her small table, talking of gardens and weather, her presence a balm that quieted the storm I had left behind. And though part of me ached at the thought of my own home being treated as a playground, another part felt calm, knowing that their performance was the desperate thrash of those who knew the tide had already turned. When I returned later, the house was strewn with empty glasses and perfume lingering in the air. Macy smirking as she asked if I had enjoyed my evening out, but I simply wished her a good night and climbed the stairs, my heart steady, my mind already on the morning to come. Day 30 dawned grey and damp, the kind of weather that settles into the bones. And I rose early, opening the curtains to see Benjamin and Macy dragging suitcases to the hall, their faces set in grudging lines. They muttered that they would be staying with a friend for a week while we think, as though they were the ones granting themselves leave, as though the decision were theirs to make, and I let them have their small pretense. I waited until the last car door slammed, until the drive was empty, and then I called the locksmith, who arrived with quiet efficiency, changing the locks with lawful precision, his tools clicking and turning like a hymn of finality. When he handed me the new set of keys, cool metal resting in my palm, I felt a chapter close as cleanly as a book snapping shut. The license had ended, the notice fulfilled, and the house was mine again, not only in name, but in truth. I stood in the hallway, breathing in the silence, the kind of silence that belongs not to loneliness, but to peace. And I knew the deadline had not broken me, but freed me. It was the second night after the locks had been changed when the pounding began. Fists against the new door that echoed through the hallway like thunder, Macy's voice slicing through the quiet as she shouted that they would take back their home, her words so loud that the neighbor's dog began to bark. I stood in the hallway with the keys clutched in my hand, my body trembling, though my resolve stayed steady. And I thought of all the years I had spent keeping peace by swallowing words, now replaced by the sound of a woman demanding what had never belonged to her. The pounding grew louder until I feared the glass panes might crack, and then the knock changed, slower, heavier, Benjamin's voice calling my name, softer but no less insistent, asking me to open the door, to be reasonable, to undo the line I had drawn. I did not open it. Instead, I rang the police, and within 20 minutes a PCSO arrived, a calm young man in uniform who spoke to Macy on the step while I watched from the hall, his presence a shield against her storm. He checked the paperwork I had kept safe in a folder, the license, the 30-day notice, the deeds in my name, and after a careful glance, he told her plainly that this was a civil matter, that the homeowner was Lucy Jones, and that shouting at her door in the night would only make matters worse. Macy raged, threatened, muttered about rights. But in the end, she left, her heels striking the pavement like gunfire until silence returned. My hands shook as I closed the curtains, but beneath the trembling was a deep steadiness, the kind that comes when truth stands firm. I slept little that night, for the quiet was broken by the phantom echoes of her fists on the door. But by morning, I had already resolved to take the next step. I walked into town and applied for a non-molestation order, explaining to the clerk the harassment, the threats, the late-night visits, each detail laid out as carefully as the entries in my diary. The process was slow, the questions formal, but when I left the courthouse with the paperwork filed, I felt lighter, as though a shield had been raised, not only in law, but in spirit. The door was still mine, the home still mine, and no storm they brought could take it back. When Benjamin came alone, it was a damp afternoon, the kind of day where clouds sag low and the garden looks weary, and I saw him standing at the gate with his hands stuffed into his pockets, like a boy caught misbehaving, though he was nearly 40 now. I opened the door and let him in, the air between us thick with things unsaid, and he sat at the kitchen table where he used to do his homework, his eyes avoiding mine, darting instead to the biscuit tin on the counter, as if comfort might still be found there. He admitted he was torn, that Macy was furious, and still convinced I had wronged them. Yet he also knew in his heart that much of what she demanded had never been hers to take. His words faltered, shame coloring his cheeks, and I felt the ache of recognizing my son caught in another's weather, his true self hidden beneath her storm. I poured tea, set the plate of biscuits between us, and when he finally lifted his gaze, I told him quietly that the door of the house was closed to them now, that love is not a tenancy, that respect and apology could mend a relationship, but they could not grant a key back into walls that had been disrespected. I offered him a path, simple but firm, a way for us to walk together again, without pretending nothing had happened. But it required honesty, it required space, and it required him to stand on his own feet rather than behind Macy's voice. His eyes brimmed then, and he nodded, tears slipping down, though he tried to brush them away with the back of his hand, like a child embarrassed to be seen. I reached across, squeezed his fingers, and placed a packet of biscuits in his palm, a gesture so small, yet filled with all the love that remained. A reminder that though the roof was no longer his, my heart still carried him. He left quietly, closing the door with care, and I watched from the window as he walked down the lane, shoulders hunched, pockets once again hiding his hands, and I whispered a prayer that he might one day find the courage to step out from her storm. The house was silent again, but this silence felt different. Not heavy with loss, but steady with resolve. A mother's line, drawn firm at last. I began with the spare room, the one Macy had once filled with rails of dresses and bottles of perfume, and I stripped it bare until the walls echoed, then opened the windows wide to let the stale air drift out, replacing it with the scent of fresh paint, as I rolled soft fern green across the plaster. Each stroke a small act of reclamation. By the time the room was dry, it no longer whispered of arguments or slammed doors, but hummed quietly with possibility, and I set about furnishing it with a round table, mismatched chairs gathered from the shed, and a teapot that had belonged to my mother. I called it Tea and Tuesdays, a little drop-in for neighbours, widows, and anyone who needed company. And to my surprise, the idea spread quickly, so that soon the room filled each week with voices, with laughter, with the clink of cups and the scent of cardamom biscuits. Mrs. Patel brought her samosas. Mrs. Hughes knitted as she chatted. And even the vicar's wife came once with a lemon drizzle that disappeared before the second pot of tea had been poured. The house, once heavy with tension, grew warm again, filled not with demands, but with community, its walls hearing kindness instead of ridicule. I would pause sometimes at the kitchen door, listening to the chatter, and feel the life return to the place Peter and I had once dreamed would always be open to others. In the quiet, after everyone left, I sat with Miss Ahmed in her office again, and together we reviewed my will, adjusting it to reflect what had become clear to me. A modest gift for Benjamin, for I still loved him, though I could not undo his choices, and the house placed in trust for community use, so that long after I was gone, its rooms would remain filled with tea, with stories, with the comfort of belonging. Signing the document, I felt not grief but relief, as though I had secured a legacy stronger than brick and mortar, a promise that the home which had endured insult and storm would now stand as refuge and haven. Walking back through the fern green room later, I ran my hand along the wall, cool and solid, and whispered that this was how I chose to reclaim not only the space but myself. One coat of paint, one pot of tea, one act of quiet defiance at a time. A year has passed, and the seasons have turned gently over the house, and this morning I knelt by the garden fence tying sweet peas to their stakes, their tendrils curling upward as though determined to climb toward the sun, and I thought how much they reminded me of myself. Patient, steady, yet unwilling to be held down. The house behind me stood quiet and proud, its rooms reclaimed, its walls no longer echoing with slammed doors, but warmed by the voices of neighbours who came for tea and Tuesdays, by the laughter of widows who had found company again, by the hum of ordinary kindness. As I brushed soil from my hands, I saw Benjamin walk slowly up the path, his posture different now, less defensive, his eyes softer. He carried no excuses this time, only words carefully chosen, a proper apology for what had been said and done, and a plan for how he meant to earn back the trust that had been frayed. He admitted the years of silence, the shame of watching and not stopping, and though I did not let him off easily, I took his hand when he offered it, feeling the weight of honesty at last. A week later, a letter arrived in Macy's handwriting, pages filled with explanations, regrets, half-stated, sentences that stopped just short of true contrition. But even so, I felt a shift, a tiny crack in the armour she had worn so tightly. I placed the letter in the biscuit tin with the deeds and Peter's notes, not as proof of forgiveness, but as a record that even the hardest stone can be worn smooth by time. That evening, I walked through the house, polished the banister with beeswax, let the smell of soap and wood polish drift through the hall, and then opened the windows wide so that the fragrance of sweet peas could mingle with it, filling the air with a clean, delicate scent that spoke not of old age, as Macy once mocked, but of life tended with care, of dignity preserved, of love planted and watered until it bloomed again. Standing in the doorway, I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with all of it, and I thought of Peter, of the sacrifices folded into every brick, of the journey from silence to speech, from surrender to strength. This was my house, my sanctuary, my legacy, and at last it smelled only of home.